writers, you're listening to the Kobo Writing Life podcast, where we bring you insights and inspiration for growing your self-publishing business. We're your hosts. I'm Rachel, promotion specialist at Kobo Writing Life.
And I'm Joni, author relations manager at Kobo Writing Life. Before we get into today's episode, we wanted to give you a heads up that for the time being, we will be releasing these episodes on a bi-weekly basis instead of weekly. So if you miss us on those alternating weeks, we do have a large backlist of over 280 episodes. It's a great time to catch up on some of those old interviews.
As for this week, Joni and Shayna sat down with Matty Dalrymple, who is an author of suspenseful novels. She is a speaker on the craft of writing and is the host of the Indy Author Podcast.
This was a really fun conversation. It was interesting to talk to somebody else that does a podcast with indie authors and who is, of course, an author herself, as you mentioned. Matty had a lot of great insights about things that she'd learned from people she'd interviewed on the podcast. And it was also really cool doing this with Shayna because both Shayna and Matty have collaborated with Mark Lefebvre, who is the former Kobo Writing Life director, on different projects and books. And so that was really cool to hear about. It's a great interview, and we hope you enjoyed as much as we did. Okay, we are here today with Matty Dalrymple. Thank you so much for joining us.
It is super fun to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
Can you start by telling our listeners a little bit about yourself and about your podcast?
Sure. So I started out in the writing and publishing world as a fiction author. I am the author of the Ann Kinnear suspense novels and suspense shorts and the Lizzie Ballard thriller trilogy. And then after a few years of writing fiction, I started the Indy Author Podcast, and that's Indy with a Y, I-N-D-Y. And I talk to people about the writing craft and the publishing voyage, as I like to say. I'm very much into using nautical metaphors to frame up those activities. I've never found a part of the writing craft or the publishing voyage that didn't lend itself to a nautical metaphor. So yeah,
I noticed that. I thought that was cool.
Yeah.
Do you sail? Are you a sailor?
I used to go boating more than I do. I had a period of time when I was spending a lot of time on sailboats. I had a period of time when I was spending a lot of time on motorboats. And unfortunately, I've sort of lost some of my entrees to those worlds, but I do have friends who are sailors or boaters. And then when I'm looking for a good metaphor, sometimes I'll call them up and say, as an example, with the book I co-wrote with Mark Lefebvre, Taking the Short Tack, it's about short fiction. So I need a nautical term that has the word short in it. And so that's how I came up with the short tack. But I look through, nautical dictionaries and things like that, looking for phrases and then saying, oh man, that is perfect for such and such.
That's really cool. I spent a lot of time sailing this summer, so I was very tickled by the nautical references. And then also when you start sailing and people start using the language around you, you realize how every single idiom in English just about originally has a nautical background. It's very cool.
Yeah, exactly.
Awesome. And can you tell us, how did your podcast come to be? You started it in 2016, is that right?
Yes, I started in 2016 on a very informal basis. So basically, I was a member of a local writers group, the Brandywine Valley Writers Group, and there were people in that group who had knowledge that I was hoping to gain from my own publishing voyage and writing craft. And so one person who was really expert at preparing for and giving readings, somebody else who had experience with the small press publisher, someone else who had experience reaching media outlets. And so I would interview them, and almost as a thank you to them for spending the time to talk to me about their areas of expertise, I would record the interview. At that time, it was audio only, and I would put it out as a podcast, which meant that some months I would have 2 or 3 episodes. Some months I didn't have any. It was very sporadic. And it was really, for me, as a community building activity and for other people, mainly in the writing group, who knew these people, knew them to be experts. And I thought, well, I can share this information out with them. And then in 2019, when I left my corporate job and I decided to make a go of full-time job as a writer and publisher and podcaster, I realized the importance of coming to a more regular and reliable schedule. And so I started, by that time I was also publishing video, which was helpful. And then I went to a weekly schedule. So every Tuesday, an episode of the Indy Author Podcast comes out. But I have to say, it's still largely both a community building and a networking effort on my part. I would like it to become an income earning opportunity as well. But that's definitely a long goal, not something that I'm seeing is going to happen in the near term, but the opportunity to speak to people that I admire and then to share their insights with my fellow authors.
Is there anything in particular that stands out to you, or a particular guest, or something that you've learned from your years of doing the podcast? I know that's a big question.
Yeah, it is a big question. Well, I started down the indie route because I'm a huge fan of Joanna Penn of the Creative Penn. And I've been thrilled to have Joanna on my podcast talking about futurist topics. So many of the things that she recommends are things that I strongly believe in. Like I already mentioned, the idea of the multiple streams of income, the power of indie. And in some cases, the conversations I've had with my guests about, let's say, the publishing voyage have reinforced my belief in the route I'm taking. In some cases, they've offered alternative perspectives that I've at least considered. In some cases, I've decided they're not for me. In some cases, I've tweaked my approach to accommodate them. But I just think it's, in general, so helpful to listen to people, to speak with people who have thought deeply about a particular topic and to exchange ideas with them. And I'll just also put in a plug that I just had landmark episode 100 with our mutual friend, Mark Leslie Lefebvre, talking about being the relaxed author. And then the following 7 episodes, 101 through 107, are with Orna Ross of the Alliance of Independent Authors. And we're talking about the 7 processes of publishing. So we're having a series that within the series, it's editing, design, production, distribution, marketing, promotion, and selective rights licensing. And that was so valuable to me because, some of the things were very familiar to me, and this was going to be a good base level resource for people who are new to it. Some of the ideas she brought up were things that I should have remembered, but had sort of drifted off the radar. And so it was a good reminder to me. And some of them were net new ideas. And so I don't know that I can put my finger on one topic, but it's just that idea of always tickling the brain, always making sure that you're keeping fresh and not getting in a rut with one's approach to either the craft or the publishing.
So I have something in common with you. Actually, I have a few things in common with you, which is funny. So I'm a writer also. And I see that you, like you were just saying, you wrote a book with Mark Lefebvre called Taking the Short Tack. So I also co-wrote a book with Mark called Macabre Montreal. It's in his series of books. Yeah,
I did make that connection.
About ghost stories.
Yeah.
And was this your first co-write when you were co-writing with Mark, or have you co-written before?
No, this was my first experience. And it came about because when I had written I wrote the first 2 Anne Kinnear suspense novels, The Sense of Death and The Sense of Reckoning. And then I had an idea for a story that didn't really fit into the Anne Kinnear world. So all my books have a theme of what happens when an extraordinary ability transforms an ordinary life. And Anne Kinnear's extraordinary ability is that she's a woman who can sense spirits. But I set this against a very kind of everyday world of, it's business, it's run by her brother, they sign contracts, she has engagements, as if she were a business consultant, which she kind of is. And so I had written 2 of those, but then I had an idea for another story, but it relied on an extraordinary ability that was somewhat different. That became the Lizzie Ballard thrillers. And so I started on the first of those books, Rock, Paper, Scissors, thinking that it was going to be a standalone. And then I finished that, and I was telling the Anne fans, just stand by. As soon as I'm done with Rock, Paper, Scissors, I'll be back to Anne. And then I realized that the Lizzie story was a trilogy. So I was working away on stories 2 and 3. But wanted to give the Anne fans something to sort of tide them over. So I started writing the Anne Kinnear suspense shorts. So I was publishing those as standalones on all the various retail platforms. And I contributed one to an anthology that was supporting a local library. I kept one as a reader magnet for people who signed up for my newsletter. And then I thought there's got to be more I can do with these stories that I have. And so I was listening to Mark's Stark Reflections on Writing and Publishing podcast, and he made a kind of passing mention of short fiction. And I sent him a note as a patron of the podcast and said, I would love to hear more about this idea of what can you do with short fiction. Would you be willing to do a podcast episode on it? And, Mark, he very graciously did. I think the title of the episode was 10 Ways You Can Use Short Fiction to Earn Money. And he did 13 because he's that kind of guy. So after that, I got in touch with him and I said, I think we have a book's worth of information here. And so, again, he very graciously agreed. And it turned out to be a great partnership, I think, because he has huge experience in the short fiction world. I was newer to it. He also has experience on both the indie and traditional sides of short fiction, whereas I was coming to it with a strictly indie publishing point of view. And then I think the other thing that made us, could have been a problem, but turned, I think, to be a strength is that I spent several decades as a project manager in the corporate world. So I'm all about spreadsheets and efficiency and going through checklists. And Mark is just a people person, right? So we were able to bring both those perspectives to the information we shared in the book. So that was a great experience. I think I got spoiled because my experience with co-authoring with Mark was so good. Love to hear your story about how your experience with Mark was.
Oh yeah, it was good, but mine was more like he was my boss here at Kobo Writing Life, and I just badgered him. I'm like, oh, so you did one about ghost stories in Hamilton and one about in Sudbury, and well, maybe you want to do one in Montreal, because I'm in Montreal, so maybe we should just write it. And that's how that happened.
Yeah, there's the theme of, come on, Mark, co-write a book with me.
Mark's always up for writing new books, so it really wasn't that hard to convince him.
Yeah.
But yeah, anyways, that's funny. So what do you think, like, in your opinion, by using your short fiction, like, what's the avenue that has worked out the most for you in terms of like actually being profitable?
Well, I am a big fan of putting short fiction up as standalones on the retail platforms. So I sell my Anne Kinnear suspense shorts for 99 cents on all the retail platforms. My goal is, once I've gotten 12 of them, I'm going to put them together in a collection called A Year of Kinnear, and then have one story that's set in each month of the year. So that will be, 12, 13 new offerings I'll have for my readers. And it's very interesting that I can see that when somebody buys one of the shorts, they normally buy all of them, because I'll go for a couple of days, I won't have any sales, and then I'll have like one of each, one of each of the stories. So the last time I checked, I had made a little over $200 from my suspense shorts. And that is, I think, more than I could have made if I had sold them to the kinds of traditionally published platforms that were willing to accept.
Yeah, like a magazine or
stories, right, from somebody who didn't already have a big name. And so I've been pleased with the results. And the other thing is, of course, I'm going to be getting whatever it is, 35 cents, 40 cents, whatever the platform supports. I'm going to be getting that money every time somebody buys it, for the rest of my life. And so that's worked out very well for me. When I was working on taking the short tack with Mark, I thought, I'm going to try everything that we put in here, many of which I did not have experience with, but Mark did. And I did try to go down the traditional publishing route, and also followed some of the advice of a book that I recommend people read along with taking the short tack, which is Douglas Smith's Playing the Short Game, which gives great information about the rights considerations for how you can make the most from your short fiction by making sure you retain the rights to reuse it over and over again. And was submitting to, the big names in the crime, suspense, mystery genres, because both Doug and Mark and I recommend start with the top, because why not? And it was just so tedious, and it took forever. And there are still submissions that I've not heard back from. And that's been a year and a half. I don't know. And I just found that the whole short fiction traditional publishing market was really not for me, because it took too long. It didn't pay enough, and I didn't have the patience to wait it out. It would have been fabulous to have the cachet of saying, oh yeah, my story has been in Alfred Hitchcock magazine or wherever, but it just wasn't worth it to me. And so I found that the best route for me, both from a satisfaction and a money-making point of view, has been putting it up on the retail platforms as standalones.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, because they're shorter, so you can write them more quickly, and that's perfect for self-publishing, right? So just get them out there and use them as you can. I was also published in a couple of literary magazines, right out of university after I did my creative writing degree. And I've been working those ever since. Those two, dropping the name, Fiddlehead, and then never really.
Why not? I mean, it might be worth it to people to pursue that for at least one story. So you do have that bragging rights. I mean, bragging rights are fun, right?
And then you can move on.
Yeah, I would.
But the other thing is like, it's yes, prestige, but it's going to reach more readers on the retail platform. People are going to still be reading that for as long as you have it published. Whereas I feel like the length of time when it's a literary publication is not as long.
Absolutely. Like,
Yeah.
that magazine's been published. How
And
many people are reading back issues, you know?
Right. The trick there would definitely be to make sure there's a reversion clause in the contract that you're signing with that publication so that when a year goes by or whatever, you yourself are able to make sure it gets out in front of people again or pursue anthologies or something like that. Because, yeah, short fiction, in my opinion, is not a moneymaker unless you can use it over and over again in many different scenarios.
Yeah, exactly. And now, so after writing Macabre Montreal, there was like, I don't know, like a year and a half ago or maybe a little bit more, Mark was like, oh, we have to publish a book of shorts, like, because there were a couple of chapters that got excluded from the book. He's like, we got to reuse this stuff. I feel like it must have been around the time that you guys were writing your book because he was so excited about it. I'm just like, okay, we can do it.
Yeah, I hope that Mark got something out of that experience as much as I did. And it sounds like maybe he was channeling the book when he gave you that advice.
Yeah, that's really funny. So we have something else in common too. So when I was looking at your Anne Kinnear series and you were talking about how she's a spirit censor in the book. So I also write about spirits and ghosts in my fiction. So that was just funny. So I was just wondering how you became interested in people who can see spirits. Do you have this power? Does someone in your family have this power? Is this just something that you've always liked?
Well, as with subsequently many of my books, the idea for The Sense of Death, which was the first Anne Kinnear book, started out as a scene, like a scene in a movie. It played out very visually for me. And the scene as I originally pictured it is a woman who is able to sense spirits, goes to a house. At the time, it was a beautiful Victorian in San Francisco, because my sister lived in San Francisco and I was visiting her a lot at the time. And she arrives at the house and she's been contracted, she's has an engagement to go to the house and check it out for someone who's thinking about buying it, because her client, she has kind of a crazy client who just wants to spend all her time looking for ghosts with Anne. And so she shows up and she can't go into the building because she has this horrible sense. The reader knows, but Anne does not know that a murder took place there. So I frame them up as suspense novels because that first one was definitely, you see the murder, it happens right up front, you know who done it. So it's not a who done it, it's a will he get away with it. So I have to say that I don't know why that first scene was so focused on someone who could sense spirits. I have never had that experience, although my husband has had an interesting experience that he and his family many years ago went to the Gettysburg battlefield, and they were there at night, and were walking across, they were going to, like a particular site where a particularly bloody battle during the Civil War took place. And they were walking back in a line, and his dad was behind him. And my husband felt his dad kind of pushing him between the shoulder blades as if he wanted him to go faster. And so my husband turned around and there wasn't anybody there. I know. And so I love stories like that. And although I don't know that I thought it through completely when I was working on The Sense of Death, it's great fodder for mystery and suspense because there's really no limit to the trouble that Anne can get into by talking with dead people and either finding out things that no one else can find out or, conveying messages that no one else would be able to convey. So the topic interested me. And, as I said, my books are what happens when an extraordinary ability transforms an ordinary life. And I just think that idea of you change one thing in an otherwise normal world, I think is fascinating. So a couple of books that I have seen that do that are Charlene Harris's Harper Connolly books. So her Sookie Stackhouse books are sort of different. There's a whole big world of weirdness going on there, but I didn't discover her Harper Connolly books until fairly recently because I was watching a thread on social media and one of my Facebook ads that I'm running says, bless the heart of whatever reviewer wrote this, but the review quote was like Charlene Harris at her best. And then someone had put a note on that comment saying, I read it and it doesn't sound like Sookie Stackhouse. And then someone else said, oh, it's not really like Sookie Stackhouse. It's much more like Harper Connolly. And I was like, Harper Connolly, never heard of that one. And it's very much like that. So Harper Connolly is a character. I think that, sorry, Charlene, this was an accident. I think her brother runs her business and she can sense where bodies are. similar kind of scenario. And also with the Lizzie Ballard, my own Lizzie Ballard books, again, Lizzie has a special ability, an extraordinary ability. I won't say what it is because it would be a bit of a spoiler. But just
I noticed that in your description. I'm like, but what is it? Okay.
Yeah, I'll have to read to find out. But I love that, just tweaking one thing.
Yeah, that's really cool.
And having it be a what if scenario.
Yeah, for sure. So what are you working on now?
I am working on Anne Kinnear Book 5. And I had my learning from this, for those in your audience who are authors who are listening, is that especially when I left my corporate job, I had a goal of writing 2 novels a year. And so I had one come out in October of 2020. I had one come out in April of 2021. I was like, oh, this is great. I just have to get one out in October of 2021. Okay, so now it's October 21st when we're recording this, and it's not going to be out this month. And that's okay. It is okay, because what I realized is that I might be able to write a book in 6 months, but it's not going to be a book I want to share with readers, because I need a period of time when I'm just thinking about it, And so I decided that I'm more of a 9-month gestation period kind of writer. And so actually I'm going to try to get Anne Kinnear 5 out by the end of the year. But I think one of the reasons I need some time is I'm just kind of bored with it at the moment.
That's never good. To force yourself to keep going when you're bored with it, it's always really painful.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to giving it to my editor at the end of the month, and he's going to have it for a couple of weeks. And I actually already have an idea for Anne Kinnear 6. And so it's in a particular location that's near where I live. And so fortunately, I have a friend who has a place there who's letting me use it. I'm going to be there for several days and start outlining Anne Kinnear 6. And then I think by the time I get back to Anne Kinnear 5, when I get the editor's comments back, I'm going to be excited about it again. Yeah, so that's what I'm working on at the moment.
Awesome.
I'm interested. Like, when you mention the time it takes to write a book, I think there's a little bit of a sense in the indie community that people are writing really fast and they're releasing all the time. And do you find that, as an author talking to other authors all the time, do you find that you actually realize that that's not really true, that people take different amounts of time? Or what do you find that most people do? Do you think that is as pervasive as it seems, is really what I'm trying to say? Because I feel like when we talk to people, the amount of time it takes to write a book varies so much more than the sort of very noisy narrative that, like, you got to get it out every 2 months.
Yeah, it is very interesting. And I think it's hard to get, even with all the people I talk to on my podcast, even with all the people you talk to on your podcast, it's hard to get an objective sense, because no one's out there saying, and then I took 3 years to write my book. Mm-hmm. Like, not that there's anything wrong with that, but it's not going to be a headline. Mm-hmm. Like someone says, I release every 2 weeks. That's a headline because it's so bizarre. And I also think that if people are wanting to make a career of being an author, and that's all they're looking at, then they're kind of forced into that scenario where they're having to release very rapidly. So I know I could never do that, which is why I rely on multiple sources of income. And I also think it depends on the kind of book you're writing. So I started hearing these, releasing a book a month. And of course you think, well, if they can do it in a month, I should at least be able to do it in 6 months. And so I finally went out on a Facebook group. I can't remember what Facebook group it was. And I said, I'm writing in the suspense, mystery, thriller genre. And what would you say is a series of books that's being rapid release that you think is high quality? It's not just cranking out junk.
That's the key word there.
Yeah. And so I got a name and I read the book and I was like, that's pretty good. It's not my kind of thing. But I realized that I think that what the author did in order to be able to produce it quickly was to leave out a lot of the color commentary, I'll say. Like, she would have a scene where, the characters walked into the bar and went over to the, sat down on the bar stools and ordered a beer. I was like, okay, but I kind of want to know, like, is it a biker bar? Is it a elegant bar? Are there other, I want more. I want more description. And I think the person was writing quickly because she wasn't spending a lot of time on that kind of detail, which I like as a reader. So even though I could recognize that the quality was good, it wasn't my kind of book. And then the other thing is, it was a pretty straightforward storyline. And so in all my stories, who knows what, when is always very important. I think especially in a suspense or mystery novel, this is going to be very important, to the extent that when I'm nearing the end of the draft, I have to put together a spreadsheet that has all the characters across the top, all the chapters down the side. And then in each cell, I put, well, Fred in chapter 2 thinks this. And so when I'm done, I can read across to see everything that's going on at that time, at the time of chapter 2, what's going on with everybody. And then I can read down the Fred column and say, is Fred's progression logical? Oh, here he's acting like he knows somebody that he hasn't met before. I'm going to have to go back and fix that. So if you start introducing those kinds of complexities, then it's just going to take longer. If you're writing more like just a straightforward narrative, one person is chasing another person and will he catch up with them or not, it's less complex. So I think the writing fast thing is such a tangled web. And I think I'm seeing, at least in the people I'm talking to, that authors are backing off a little bit from this faster, faster, faster. Mm. In fact, last year I took a business strategy course with Nicholas Eric and Lisa Dino. And one of the things they did at the time was that at the end, you would write up your business plan and then you would review it with them. And at the time, I don't know what I was on, but I not only had the 2 novels a year planned, but I also had a nonfiction book baked into that. And they basically said, just calm down a little bit. And they even said to me, as people who they themselves publish rapidly, this isn't right for every book. And they even said, I think I can credit them for saying, if you're writing a more complex book, you need more time to do it. And so thank heavens, because it saved me a lot of headache. But it's a tough question.
It's not for everyone. And I can't see how writing that fast, there's not like a sacrifice, like you're saying. It's not necessarily sacrifice of like quality, but they are leaving out description. Like you can't have complicated stuff going on. And if you're writing that quickly, or even things that need excessive amounts of research, right? So like,
yes,
people who write that quickly and they're writing like fantasy, I don't even understand how they're doing it, because you have to make a whole world, right?
Yeah.
And keep track of everything that's going on in that world. So yeah, it's nice to hear other people, like you said you were trying to do 3 books a year and they're like, whoa, okay, like you don't have to do all 3. And there's other people who are releasing like 12 a year and they're just like, oh yeah, that's totally normal.
Yeah. And you also don't know what's going on behind the scenes. It might be someone who spent 5 years writing 12 books, bless their heart, and then release them quickly. So you can't, as a reader, assume that if book 1 comes out in January and book 2 comes out in February, that the person spent 4 weeks writing it. So
no, exactly. That actually literally happened to me. Like the 2 books that I released more recently, I released them a year apart, which is still a year. But people are like, my uncle's like, like, oh, how are you writing these so fast? I'm like, oh, no, there was 10 years before that. So, it's not that fast at all.
Yeah.
But I think this is where these like conversations on the author podcast are really valuable, because if there's one thing that we've learned is that there isn't one correct way to do this and everyone's doing it differently, and it does depend on your circumstance. And I think that can be quite reassuring to get those different perspectives. I think it's really important.
Yeah, actually, if there is one theme that almost universally every person who's come on the podcast to talk about craft has said, it is that there are no rules, there are only suggestions. And the importance of making sure that the suggestions that you're assessing are right for your own preference, your own style, your own circumstances.
So you have a book that is kind of a guide to setting up an author podcast. Because, okay, here's the thing. I don't think doing a podcast is for everyone. It's a lot of work and it takes time away from your writing, but it is also a really, really valuable thing to do. If somebody's listening and they're kind of interested, like, what do you think people should know before they get into this? Like, who do you think is the ideal person to start something like this?
Well, I think it's completely a matter of aligning what you want to achieve, what you feel comfortable doing with what your approach is going to be. And so if anyone is thinking of starting a podcast, what I would recommend is that they go to my website, the Indy Author. It's Indy with a Y, INDY. And there's a tab that says Podcasting for Authors. And if you scroll down, there's a downloadable document called the Captain's Log, because, nautical metaphors. And it walks through, actually what I've done there is I've extracted the questions that I ask at the end of every chapter of the book, The Indie Author's Guide to Podcasting for Authors. And the early ones are really focused on understanding your goal and then considering what your preferred approach would be. So as an example, I think earlier we've been talking about when I first started the Indy Author Podcast, and that I was really looking at it as an educational and network building effort. Mm-hmm. And then it also became a paying it forward to my fellow authors effort. Those were my driving circumstances at the time. And then later, when I left my corporate job, I added the desire to at least make it self-sustaining from a financial point of view. And so the approach I'm going to take is going to be different based on that than if I had a different goal. So because the networking and community building aspect is so important to me, I'm going to do an interview show, because I really have no interest in just gassing on for 45 minutes about whatever I'm doing in my own writing craft and publishing voyage. I want to share out information that other people have. So that kind of defined the approach I was going to take, which was going to be an interview. You know, those decisions about what is your topic and then how many episodes do you have there? My recommendation is be able to write down 24 things that you'd want to talk to people about before you start talking to them. Because if you think, oh, I really want to do a podcast on how to format ebooks, and I think there's really a trend toward niching down on topics. I'm not complying with that rule, but because it's a guideline, not a rule. But you can only come up with 3 things you want to talk about, then maybe either hold off until you can come up with more, because otherwise you're going to have a podcast series that has 3 episodes in it and then pod fades. Or reconsider what you want to focus on. Maybe it's not how to format your book. Maybe it's more generally the book production process, or, keep playing with it. So there was a statistic that I kept coming across, and I was never able to find like the actual source of this, but it came up so much that I think there must be some anecdotal truth to it, which is that 70% of podcasts never get beyond 7 episodes.
Yeah, I think I've heard that.
Yeah. And there would really be nothing more painful than investing the time and the money and everything into getting a podcast up, investing your personal capital, and then getting to 7 and going, no, I'm out. And so a lot of the Indie Author's Guide to Podcasting for Authors, the early chapters are about, here are the considerations you want to think about before you launch that podcast.
Yeah, I imagine that your background as a project manager has paid off in this also. It's a lot of moving parts.
Yeah, the later chapters then are sort of assuming, okay, you've gotten this far, now you're really into it. And so I also offer, I think another free resource on the website is the checklist, like make sure you've turned notifications off, make sure the dogs have just been out, make sure you have your mic turned on, those kinds of things. So it really runs the gamut to very strategic considerations to very tactical assistance.
We should give people these lists. Actually, that's a good idea.
Well, there is a chapter on being a good podcast guest and taking a good approach to pitching yourself to podcasts too. So, there's something in it for both sides of the interview format.
Do you find that you are not short on content? Do people reach out to you? Do you do most of the outreach? How does that work for you?
I have been doing most of the outreach. Just in the last several months, maybe year, I've started getting more people pitching me. Mm-hmm. And it is super annoying to get a pitch letter that is very obviously a form letter, and the only change they've made is to replace hi, Matty. And in fact, I got one back when Jay Thorne and Zach Bohannon had the Career Author Podcast, and they evidently had just sent an email pitching Jay and Zach for the Career Author Podcast. And now they were sending one to me, but they forgot to change the stuff. No. So it said, hi, Matty, I think I would be a great guest for the Career Author Podcast. And I was like, dude, it's not even my podcast. So that's one of the tips, know the podcast you're pitching to and make sure you make sense. And so I have found I'm still sort of preferring to solicit guests myself, because then I know that there's a tie-in. I generally solicit people that I've heard on podcasts or seen them in video, so I can tell whether they're going to be comfortable or not. I've also had the experience of having a publicist pitch me for their client. Mm-hmm. And I was very excited to get the client. I mean, I looked up the client. I was like, whoa, yeah, that's definitely somebody I want to talk to. And it seemed clear to me that the publicist had not okayed the pitch with her client before she made the pitch, because I kind of sensed that the client wasn't all that excited about being on the podcast. So if you do it yourself, you can get a sense of the enthusiasm level.
But one of the best things about podcasts, though, is that most people actually do say yes. Sometimes we will ask people that really are far too big for our podcast, and they'll say yes because it's 40 minutes of their time, and a lot of people are quite happy to chat. It's great.
Absolutely. I have been so thrilled. I'm not going to, I might name a name if I can think of one. The one I'll name is Ben Winters. So Ben Winters is one of my favorite authors. He's the author of The Last Policeman series and Underground Airlines and Golden State, many others. It's definitely one of those sort of like A Normal World, but something has been tweaked. And so I was following his book tour for his most recent book. And so I was at part of the audience when he was doing one of these interviews, and he was just so interesting. And I thought, hey, why not? And exactly like he said, I sent him a note. I had actually interacted with him. I submitted questions and I said, oh, I'm the person who asked this question. And he was super gracious and we had so much fun. And it's somebody I would never have gotten a chance to talk to otherwise. I mean, I think that's still what's driving me with the podcast, that I get to talk to these people I would never otherwise. So that was kind of my personal satisfaction out of it. But from a purely practical point of view, you get people on the podcast who have a large, maybe a podcast of their own or a large social media following or a large fan base. And then you make it very easy for them to plug their episode to their fan base. You give them the social media graphics, you give them all the links, you set an expectation about what they could play up in their material. And it's a great way of attracting additional people. So it's, a factor to consider. You don't want to be totally cutthroat about it and only get people on that already have big followings, but it's a consideration. It's a great way to increase your reach.
Do you have an ultimate dream guest that you would love to interview?
Well, it's funny. I think who was I talking to? I was talking to Dale Roberts of Self-Publishing with Dale. Dale has been a frequent guest on my podcast and super nice person. And so he asked that question and I said, well, I have to say Joanna Penn. And then he did this whole Joanna, are you listening to us? Matty was. And then he did this whole, so he was doing that. And I said, this is kind of like proposing to someone on the Jumbotron. And so he did this follow-up video he had gotten a graphic of a Jumbotron and he had put my picture on it saying, I would really like to have Joanna Penn of the Creative Penn on my podcast. And then he put it on social media and flagged Joanna. So then pretty soon she was on my podcast. But I have to say that I kind of feel bad listing out because I know I'm going to forget somebody. I'm sorry. But, Mark Lefebvre has been on the podcast a number of times. Zach Bohannon, Jay Thorne, we had talked about earlier. They've been on the podcast. Orna Ross of the Alliance of Independent Authors, Michael Laron. I've kind of worked through the people who are on my bucket list to begin with. And now, of course, I'm formulating more people for the bucket list. Tiffany Yates Martin on the craft side has been on several times. She's an editor with Fox Print Editorial. So yeah, I feel like I've checked off a lot of my heroes. And now as, new heroes come along, I'm preparing my pitches to them to be on the podcast as well.
That's really cool. And I love that story.
That's Dale's a great guy. I got to just do that.
He is. I'm like, how much time did you spend on that? It was quite elaborate, the Jumbotron video he had done. So that was super fun.
That's awesome.
Very cool. And where can listeners find you online? You are at the Indy Author Podcast?
Yep. If they want to go to the Indy Author, indyauthor.com. It's Indy with a Y, INDY. They can find all my nonfiction platform material on the writing craft and the publishing voyage. And if they want to look at my fiction work, they can go to mattydalrymple.com. And that's Matty with a Y, MATTY, and find all the links to social media and other resources and so on.
Amazing. We will include those links. And then we always like to finish off by asking you some rapid fire questions about what you've been reading and what you've been enjoying. So let's do that. Do you have a favorite author?
Well, Ben Winters, as I mentioned. Another author that I've really been enjoying is Ben Aronovich. And he similarly has a kind of what happens when an extraordinary ability transforms an ordinary life theme, because his books are kind of traditional British police procedurals, except there's magic. So there's magic in the world. It's kind of accepted, but people don't really talk about it because it's kind of, considered not very polite. But there's this one division within the London Police Department that is specifically aimed at addressing issues where magic seems to be involved. So It's called the Rivers of London series. So that's been great. And I was embarrassed that I'd never read anything by Anne Rivers Siddons until recently. And I was on vacation. I went by a library that had one of those, pick up a book, leave a buck kind of things out front. And so I picked up a book by Anne Rivers Siddons called The House Next Door. And I just loved it. It was kind of a super creepy haunted house, sort of like The Haunting of Hill House, except slightly updated. I think it was from the late 70s or early 80s, maybe, but that was a super fun read.
What is the best book you read this year? This might overlap.
Yeah, I'm gonna say the Anne Rivers Siddons book.
Is there another genre that you wish you could write in, but you don't? Like, for example, for me, it's definitely fantasy. I don't think I can create a whole universe like that. It's a hard one, eh?
That is a good one.
It's not a quick question.
I would say fantasy also, because I love the idea when I read books that are really thoroughly fleshed out like that. One I just read recently that I really loved was the Hugh Howey book. Sorry, Hugh. Yes, thank you. I came up with dust, and I know that's not it. Yeah, well, thank you.
It's one word.
Yeah. It's that Noun series by Hugh Howey. I would love to do that. Yeah, so I'm going to go with sort of that sci-fi fantasy genre.
And then moving away from books, because you're a podcaster, I had to ask, are there any podcasts that you have been listening to and loving lately? And they don't have to be book ones, anything at all?
Well, I have to say that I generally do listen to craft or publishing voyage ones. I had mentioned Mark's Stark Reflections, Joanna Penn's The Creative Pen podcast. Actually, one that I listened to recently that was not about the writing, craft, and publishing voyage is that I was, earlier in the year, I was driving from my home outside Philadelphia to Maine, where my husband and I frequently vacation. And I decided that in order to miss the New York City metropolitan area, I was going to go quite far west. And I had friends who lived in New Hampshire, and I decided that I would stay with them. So I drove up there, was in New Hampshire. It was right near where the Man in the Mountain used to be before it collapsed. And then the next day I was driving over across New Hampshire and Western Maine to Mount Desert Island, which is where we were vacationing. And I was saying, are there any podcasts? Is there anything you'd recommend I listen to? And he said, you have to listen to this podcast called Blackout, because it takes place right near where I was driving through. So I thought, that's great. So I started it up as one of these kind of radio drama podcasts, very, very well done. And it was all about blackout hits. Actually, I think it turns out to be the entire world. But, a blackout hits New Hampshire, and then they realize, no, it's not just New Hampshire. It's all of New England. Oh, no, it's Canada, too. And, it gets worse and worse. And then the survivalists are hoarding food. And it took place in Keene and Berlin, I think is how they pronounce it. So I'm driving along at like the most creepy part of the podcast, and something's happening in Keene. And I go by the sign for Keene. I was like, This is like, if I'm driving alone through this kind of remote area, I don't think I can listen to it. But I should get back to it now. It was too creepy for me for the drive through New Hampshire, but
that sounds terrifying. Podcast. So it was a fictional story then? Yes. Oh, that's kind of cool. I don't know if I've ever listened to one. I've listened to dramatizations of real things, but I haven't ever listened to one that's fully fictional. That's kind of cool.
Yeah, I think that now with all the emphasis on audio and the recognition that so many people are looking for audio, that whole idea of sort of the radio drama is coming back, and there are a lot of fantastic ones.
Awesome. That's cool. And what can readers expect from you next? When is your next book out?
Oh, we were talking about that.
I'm still hoping before the end of the year. So I hope that Ann Kinnear fans will be able to look for Ann Kinnear Book 5 before the end of the year, which is 2021. And then 9 months after that, I'm going to say they can be looking for Ann Kinnear 6.
So I think by the time this comes out, it'll be out, because we have a few episodes coming up. So we will definitely include the link to that book. We'll check with you. And that will be good. Thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you. This has been such a fun conversation. Thank you for having me on the podcast.
Thank you for listening to the Kobo Writing Life podcast. If you are interested in picking up Maddie's books or listening to her podcast, we will include links to both of those in our show notes. If you are enjoying this podcast, please be sure to rate, review, and subscribe. And if you're looking for more tips on growing your self-publishing business, you can find us at kobowritinglife.com. And be sure you are following us on all of these socials. We are at Kobo Writing Life on Facebook and Twitter, and at kobo.writing.life on Instagram.
This episode was produced by Joni DiPlacido and Rachel Warden. Co-host was Shayna Krishnasamy. Our music is provided by Tearjerker. Editing is by Kelly Robotham, and a big thank you to Matty Dalrymple for being our guest. If you're ready to start your self-publishing journey, sign up today at kobo.com/writinglife. Until next time, happy writing.